The rain had been falling for 3 days straight in Chicago, and Maria Santos had learned to sleep in doorways where the water couldn't reach her. She was only 19 years old, but her face carried the tired look of someone who had seen too much hardship in too little time. Her clothes were old and worn, her shoes had holes in them, and her dark hair hung in tangled knots around her thin face. But there was one thing she protected more than anything else in this world, more than food, more than shelter, more than her own safety. It was a trumpet, old and scratched, with dents along its brass body and a mouthpiece that had been repaired with tape. This trumpet had belonged to her father, and it was the only thing she had left of him. Maria had not always lived on the streets. Just 2 years ago, she had been a happy girl living in a small apartment with her father, Roberto Santos. Her mother had died when Maria was just 7 years old, leaving Roberto to raise his daughter alone. Roberto was a trumpet player, not a famous one, but a man who played in small jazz clubs around the city. He never made much money, but their apartment was always filled with music. Every evening, Roberto would sit by the window and play his trumpet while Maria did her homework. The sound of that instrument was the soundtrack of her childhood, the melody of her memories, the voice of her father's love. Roberto had started teaching Maria to play the trumpet when she was just 8 years old. At first, her small lungs couldn't push enough air through the instrument to make a proper sound. She would puff and blow until her face turned red, producing only weak squeaks and funny noises. But Roberto was patient. He would laugh gently, adjust her fingers on the valves, and show her again and again how to breathe from her belly, how to shape her lips, how to make the brass sing. By the time Maria was 12, she could play simple songs. By 14, she was playing alongside her father in their tiny living room, their two trumpets creating harmonies that made the neighbors stop and listen through the thin walls. Those were the golden years. The years Maria dreamed about now when she curled up in cold doorways with her trumpet case as a pillow. Her father would come home from his late-night gigs smelling like cigarette smoke and coffee, but he always had a smile for her. Sometimes he brought her a sandwich from the club, wrapped in paper napkins. Other times he brought her sheet music he had found in used bookstores. They didn't have much money, but they had each other, and they had music. And that was enough. Everything changed the year Maria turned 17. Roberto had been coughing for months, a deep, painful cough that shook his whole body. He kept saying it was nothing, just a cold that wouldn't go away. But Maria could see him getting thinner, weaker, his fingers trembling when he tried to play. She begged him to see a doctor, but Roberto was a proud man, and they had no health insurance. Doctors cost money they didn't have. So Roberto kept playing, kept coughing, kept pretending everything was fine until the night he collapsed on stage in the middle of a song. The hospital gave them the news in a cold, white room with fluorescent lights that hummed overhead. Cancer, advanced stage, too far gone for treatment. Roberto Santos had maybe 3 months to live, maybe less. Maria sat beside his hospital bed and held his hand. The same hand that had taught her to play trumpet. The same hand that had made her breakfast every morning. The same hand that had wiped her tears when she fell off her bicycle as a child. She couldn't believe this hand would soon be still forever. Roberto died on a Tuesday morning in October, with Maria holding his hand and playing a soft tune on his trumpet because he had asked her to. His last words to her were simple but heavy with meaning. He told her to never stop playing, to never let anyone take the music from her heart, to remember that as long as she could play, he would always be with her. Maria promised through her tears, and she meant every word. She would keep playing. She would make him proud. She would carry his music with her wherever she went. But the world doesn't care about promises made to dying fathers. Within weeks of Roberto's death, Maria discovered that he had left behind debts she knew nothing about. Hospital bills, back rent, money borrowed from people who now came knocking on her door, demanding payment. She was only 17, still in high school, with no job and no relatives willing to take her in. Roberto had been her only family, and now she was completely alone. The landlord gave her 1 month to leave the apartment. She sold everything she could, the furniture, the television, her father's other instruments, but it wasn't enough. On a cold November morning, Maria walked out of her childhood home with nothing but a backpack of clothes and her father's trumpet. She had nowhere to go. The first few weeks on the street were the hardest. Maria learned quickly that being homeless meant being invisible. People walked past her like she wasn't there, their eyes sliding over her as if she was part of the sidewalk. She learned which shelters had beds available and which ones were full every night. She learned which churches gave out free meals and what times the soup kitchens opened. She learned to sleep with one eye open because there were people who would steal from you while you slept, people who saw homeless teenagers as easy targets. She learned to hide her trumpet inside her coat when she walked through certain neighborhoods because someone might take it. And she would rather die than lose her father's trumpet. That winter came, brutal and unforgiving. Maria's fingers turned blue from the cold, and she worried constantly that the frost would damage them, that she wouldn't be able to play anymore. She would find warm spots in subway stations and shopping mall entrances, places where she could tuck herself into a corner and blow warm air onto her hands. Sometimes she would take out her trumpet and practice quietly, keeping the sound low so security guards wouldn't chase her away. The music was all she had left. When she played, she could close her eyes and pretend her father was still alive, still sitting beside her in their little apartment, still nodding along to the melody with that proud smile on his face. Spring brought warmer weather, but no improvement to Maria's situation. She had turned 18 now, legally an adult, which meant she could no longer access certain programs designed for homeless youth. She fell through the cracks of a system that wasn't built to catch people like her. She applied for jobs everywhere, fast food restaurants, grocery stores, cleaning companies, but employers took one look at her worn clothes and unwashed hair and shook their heads. How can you get a job when you have no address, no phone number, no way to shower before an interview? Maria learned that poverty is a trap, with walls that grow higher the longer. You're stuck inside. The only money she made came from playing her trumpet on street corners. She would find a busy intersection or a spot outside a subway entrance and play for hours, her trumpet case open at her feet for people to drop coins and occasionally paper bills. On a good day, she might make $20. On a bad day, she might make nothing. Some people stopped to listen, their faces softening as the music reached them. Others hurried past without looking, too busy with their own lives to notice the homeless girl making beautiful sounds on a beat-up trumpet. A few people were cruel, telling her to get a real job, calling her names, once even kicking her trumpet case and scattering her coins across the sidewalk. Maria learned to let their words roll off her like water. She had to. If she let every cruel word hurt her, she wouldn't survive. It was during this time that Maria discovered she had a gift that went beyond just playing the trumpet well. She could feel what people needed to hear. When she saw a tired mother walking with crying children, she would play something soft and soothing. When she saw an old man walking alone with sad eyes, she would play something warm and comforting. When she saw young couples holding hands, she would play something romantic and hopeful. Music wasn't just sound to Maria. It was a language, a way of speaking directly to people's hearts without using words. Her father had taught her this. He used to say that a good musician plays notes, but a great musician plays emotions. Maria was becoming a great musician, and she didn't even realize it. One evening in late May, Maria set up her spot outside a fancy restaurant called Giovanni's. It was an Italian place with white tablecloths visible through large windows and a doorman in a fancy uniform standing guard at the entrance. Maria knew she probably shouldn't play here. Places like this usually called the police to chase away homeless people. But she was desperately hungry, having not eaten anything in 2 days, and rich people sometimes gave bigger tips. She positioned herself about 20 feet from the entrance, far enough to not seem threatening, close enough for the diners to hear her music. She started with a slow jazz piece, something her father used to play at his gigs. The notes floated through the evening air like golden threads, weaving between the cars passing on the street, drifting through the open windows of the restaurant. A few people coming out of Giovanni's stopped to listen. One man dropped a $5 bill in her case. A woman smiled and gave her a thumbs up. Maria played on, lost in the music, forgetting for a moment that she was hungry, tired, dirty, and alone. That's when Vincent Romano noticed her. Vincent was the owner of Giovanni's, a stout man in his 50s with silver hair slicked back and a permanent scowl on his face. He had built this restaurant from nothing, starting as a dishwasher 30 years ago and working his way up until he could buy the place outright. He was proud of Giovanni's, proud of its reputation as one of the finest Italian restaurants in Chicago. And he did not appreciate some homeless girl making noise outside his establishment, potentially driving away his wealthy customers. Vincent marched outside with his face red and his hands balled into fists. Maria saw him coming and lowered her trumpet, already preparing to gather her things and leave. She had seen this look before, the look of someone who saw her as trash to be swept away. But instead of immediately chasing her off, Vincent stopped a few feet away and crossed his arms. The man's eyes moved over her slowly, taking in her ragged appearance, her thin frame, the desperation barely hidden behind her cautious expression. He noticed the trumpet, old and battered, and something flickered in his expression. It might have been recognition, or it might have been disgust. Maria couldn't tell. She waited for him to yell at her, to threaten to call the police, to tell her she was bad for business. But Vincent just stood there, looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. Finally, he spoke, his voice gruff and impatient. He asked her what she thought she was doing, playing music outside his restaurant, like she had some right to be there. Maria's heart was pounding, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. She told him she was just trying to earn enough money to eat. She said she would leave if he wanted. She didn't mean any trouble. Her voice was steady, but inside she was shaking. She couldn't afford to get arrested. She couldn't afford to have her trumpet confiscated. She couldn't afford to lose the only thing she had left of her father. Vincent snorted, a sound somewhere between a laugh and a grunt of contempt. He told her that playing trumpet on the street wasn't going to get her anywhere. He said she should get a real job instead of begging like a bum. His words were harsh, but Maria had heard worse. She nodded and started to pack up her trumpet, her stomach growling loudly enough that she was sure Vincent could hear it. That's when Maria had an idea. It was crazy, probably stupid, definitely risky. But she was so hungry, and something about Vincent's restaurant, with its warm lights and smell of good food drifting through the door, made her desperate enough to try. She looked up at the man and asked him a question that would change both their lives forever. She asked if she could play for a free meal. Vincent Romano stared at her like she had lost her mind. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. For a moment, Maria thought he was going to laugh in her face. And he did laugh, a short, harsh bark of laughter that echoed in the evening air. He asked her if she was serious, if she really thought her street corner noise was worth a meal at his restaurant. His restaurant, where the cheapest pasta dish cost $40 and reservations had to be made weeks in advance. Maria should have been embarrassed. She should have apologized and walked away. But something in Vincent's mocking tone lit a fire in her chest, the same fire her father used to talk about, the flame that every true musician carries inside them. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and looked Vincent directly in the eyes. She told him to give her 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes to play. If he didn't think she was worth a meal after that, she would leave and never come back. But if she was good, really good, then he would feed her a proper dinner. Not scraps, not leftovers, but a real meal at a real table like a real person. Something in her voice made Vincent pause. Maybe it was the confidence, so unexpected from someone who looked like she hadn't showered in a week. Maybe it was the way she held that battered trumpet, like it was precious, like it was sacred. Or maybe it was something else entirely, some ghost from his own past that whispered in his ear to give this girl a chance. Whatever it was, Vincent found himself nodding slowly. 5 minutes, he said. Not a second more. And if he wasn't impressed, she would have to leave and never come back to this block. Maria nodded, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and excitement. She raised the trumpet to her lips, took a deep breath from her belly, just like her father taught her, and began to play. The first notes that came from Maria's trumpet were soft, almost hesitant, like a bird testing its wings before taking flight. She started with a melody she had written herself during the long, cold nights on the street, a piece that held all her pain, all her loneliness, all her memories of her father. The music rose slowly, building like a wave, gathering strength before it crashes on the shore. Vincent stood frozen in place, his arms still crossed, his expression still skeptical. But as the melody continued, something in his face began to change. Maria closed her eyes and let the music take over. She wasn't playing for Vincent anymore. She wasn't playing for Emile. She was playing for her father, for all the nights they spent making music together, for all the songs they would never play again. Her fingers moved across the valves with perfect precision, each note ringing clear and true despite the dents in her old trumpet. The sound seemed to fill the entire street, stopping people in their tracks, making them turn to find the source of this unexpected beauty. Inside Giovanni's restaurant, diners began to notice the music drifting through the open door. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. A woman at a table by the window put down her wine glass and turned to look outside. A man celebrating his wedding anniversary with his wife felt tears forming in his eyes, though he couldn't explain why. The music was doing something to everyone who heard it, reaching inside them and touching places they had forgotten existed. Vincent Romano felt his breath catch in his throat. He was transported back 40 years, to a small apartment in Brooklyn, where his mother used to play Italian love songs on an old radio. He remembered being a young boy, sitting on the kitchen floor, watching his mother cook, while music filled their tiny home. His mother had died when Vincent was 12, and he had spent his whole life trying to fill the hole she left behind. Now, listening to this homeless girl play her trumpet, he felt that whole ache with a strange mixture of sadness and warmth. Maria transitioned into a faster section, her fingers flying, the notes tumbling over each other like water rushing over rocks. There was joy in this music, pure and bright, the kind of joy that can only come from someone who has known real sorrow. She played with her whole body, swaying slightly, her face lifted toward the sky. The evening light caught the brass of her trumpet and made it glow like something magical, something from a fairy tale. People began gathering on the sidewalk. A businessman loosened his tie and leaned against a lamppost, mesmerized. A young couple stopped walking and stood hand in hand, their eyes wide with wonder. A homeless man whom Maria recognized from the shelter sat down on the curb and began to cry quietly, his shoulders shaking. Even the doorman of Giovanni's, who had been about to chase Maria away, stood with his mouth open, completely entranced by the music. The final section of Maria's piece was the hardest to play, technically and emotionally. She had written it the night after her father's funeral, when she still had an apartment, when she still had hope. It was a conversation between a daughter and her dead father, questions without answers, love that could no longer be expressed in words. The melody rose and fell like breath, like heartbeats, like the rhythm of life itself. Maria poured everything she had into those notes. Every moment of grief, every memory of happiness, every dream that had been stolen from her. When the last note faded into the evening air, there was a moment of complete silence. No one moved. No one spoke. The world itself seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, someone began to clap. Then another person. Then another. Within seconds, the entire sidewalk was filled with applause, cheers, even a few whistles. People were wiping their eyes, looking at each other in amazement, asking who this girl was and where she had come from. Vincent Romano stood perfectly still, his hands at his sides, his face unreadable. Maria lowered her trumpet and looked at him, waiting for his judgment. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She had given him everything she had, played her very soul for this man who had laughed at her. If he still turned her away, she didn't know what she would do. For a long moment, Vincent said nothing. He looked at Maria like he was seeing her for the first time, really seeing her, not as a homeless nuisance, but as a human being, as an artist. His throat moved as he swallowed hard. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, like he was fighting against emotions he didn't want to show. He told her to come inside. Doc Maria thought she had misheard him. She asked him to repeat himself, her voice barely above a whisper. Vincent cleared his throat and said it again, louder this time, almost gruffly. He said she should come inside and eat, that she had earned it, that he had never heard anyone play like that in his entire life. His tone was still rough, still guarded, but Maria could see something different in his eyes now. It wasn't pity, which she hated. It was respect. Doc Maria followed Vincent into Giovanni's, clutching her trumpet case against her chest like a shield. She was suddenly very aware of how she must look, how she must smell. The restaurant was beautiful, all dark wood and soft lighting, white tablecloths and gleaming silverware. The other diners were dressed in expensive clothes, their jewelry catching the candlelight. Maria felt like a stain on a clean shirt, like something that didn't belong. She wanted to run back outside, to disappear into the comfortable anonymity of the street. But Vincent led her to a small table in the back corner, away from the other customers, but not hidden, not shameful. He pulled out her chair himself, a gesture of respect that nearly brought Maria to tears. Then he sat down across from her, something that clearly surprised his staff, and handed her a menu. Maria stared at the menu in her hands, her eyes scanning the Italian words and fancy descriptions. She hadn't held a proper menu in over a year. She had forgotten what it felt like to choose her food, to have options, to sit at a table like a normal person. Her hands were shaking, and she hoped Vincent couldn't see. She didn't want him to know how much this meant to her. She didn't want to seem weak. Vincent watched her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Then he took the menu gently from her hands and set it aside. He told her not to worry about choosing, that he would have the chef make her something special. His voice was gruff, but there was kindness underneath, like a tough shell protecting something soft. He called over a waiter and spoke to him in rapid Italian, too fast for Maria to follow. Within minutes, food began arriving at the table. First came bread, warm from the oven, with butter and olive oil for dipping. Maria's hands trembled as she tore off a piece and put it in her mouth. The taste exploded on her tongue, so good it almost hurt. She had to force herself to eat slowly, to not shove the entire basket of bread in her mouth, like a starving animal she felt like inside. Then came soup, rich and savory, followed by pasta with a sauce that Maria couldn't identify, but that tasted like heaven. Then came chicken, perfectly cooked, with vegetables roasted in herbs. Then came dessert, a chocolate cake so decadent that Maria almost cried with every bite. She ate and ate, more food than she had seen in months, while Vincent watched her with an expression she couldn't read. When she finally sat back, her stomach full for the first time in longer than she could remember, Vincent leaned forward and asked her where she had learned to play like that. His voice was genuinely curious now, no trace of the mockery from earlier. Maria found herself telling him about her father, about the music they used to make together, about losing him and losing everything. The words came out in a rush, like water breaking through a dam. She hadn't talked to anyone about her father in so long. It felt strange and painful and somehow healing. All at once, Vincent listened without interrupting, his eyes never leaving her face. When Maria finished talking, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he told her something that surprised her more than anything else that had happened that night. He told her his mother had been a singer. Word about Maria spread through Chicago's music scene like wildfire. Within weeks, Giovanni's had a waiting list for Friday and Saturday nights, with people calling weeks in advance to reserve tables when the Trumpet girl was playing. Vincent had to turn customers away, something he had never imagined would happen. He raised his prices slightly and expanded his wine selection, knowing that people would pay premium rates for the unique experience of dining with live music that touched their souls. Maria's performances became legendary. People didn't just come to eat anymore. They came to hear her play, to be transported by her music, to feel something real in a world that often felt cold and superficial. Her reputation grew from Giovanni's regulars to their friends, then to their friends' friends, then to strangers who had heard rumors about a young trumpet player who could make you cry with a single note. Music critics began showing up unannounced, scribbling notes on napkins. trying to capture in words what Maria created with brass and breath. True to his word, Vincent helped Maria find a small studio apartment not far from the restaurant. It wasn't much, just one room with a tiny kitchen and a bathroom so small she could barely turn around in it. But to Maria, it was a palace. It was hers. She had a key that fit into a lock that opened a door behind, which was space that belonged only to her. She hung a photo of her father above her bed, the only picture she had managed to save, and every night she looked at it and told him about her day. She believed he could hear her. She believed he was proud. The months that followed were the happiest Maria had experienced since her father's death. She settled into a routine that gave her life structure and purpose. She practiced during the day, working on new pieces, experimenting with different styles, pushing herself to become better and better. In the evenings, she would walk through the city that had once been her prison and see it with new eyes. The streets where she had slept now seemed beautiful, full of life and possibility. The people who had walked past her without seeing now smiled and nodded as she passed. She was no longer invisible, but success brought unexpected challenges. As Maria's reputation grew, so did the attention she received, not all of it welcome. A music producer named Derek Patterson started showing up at Giovanni's every weekend, watching her performances with calculating eyes. Derek was a smooth talker with expensive clothes and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He represented a record label that specialized in discovering new talent and turning them into stars. He saw in Maria a gold mine, a rags-to-riches story that would make for perfect marketing. Derek approached Maria after a particularly stunning performance. Business card in hand, promises dripping from his lips like honey. He told her she was wasting her talent in this small restaurant, that she deserved to be on big stages, that he could make her famous. He talked about recording contracts and concert tours and television appearances. He painted a picture of glamour and wealth that seemed impossibly bright to a girl who had been eating from garbage cans just a year ago. Maria was tempted, deeply tempted. Who wouldn't be? The chance to share her music with millions of people, to honor her father's memory on the biggest stages in the world, to never worry about money again. She took Derek's card and promised to think about his offer. But something about him made her uncomfortable. A slipperiness that reminded her of the people on the street who would smile at you while stealing your last dollar. She talked to Vincent about Derek's offer, seeking his advice as she had begun doing for many decisions in her life. Vincent's face darkened at the mention of Derek Patterson's name. He knew men like Derek, had dealt with them in his years of building Giovanni's. They were sharks in expensive suits, predators who fed on young talent and left behind broken dreams. Vincent warned Maria to be careful, to read any contract thoroughly, to not let promises of fame blind her to the reality of the music industry. But Vincent also recognized something else, something that complicated his advice. He could see how much Maria wanted more than Giovanni's could offer her. She was a river, being forced to flow through a narrow channel when she deserved to be an ocean. He loved having her at his restaurant, loved what she had brought to his life and his business. But he cared about her too much to hold her back. If she wanted to pursue bigger dreams, he would support her, even if it meant losing her. Maria struggled with the decision for weeks. Derek kept calling, kept showing up at Giovanni's, kept increasing his offers. He sensed her hesitation and worked to overcome it, sending flowers to her apartment, arranging for industry people to come hear her play, dropping hints about other opportunities that would pass her by if she waited too long. The pressure built until Maria felt like she was going to break. One night, after a particularly exhausting performance, Maria sat alone in the empty restaurant with her trumpet in her lap. The tables were cleared, the lights were dimmed, and the silence felt heavy after hours of music. She thought about her father, about what he would want her to do. Roberto Santos had never been famous. He had played in small clubs his entire life, content with modest success as long as he could make music. But he had always told Maria she was better than him, that she had a gift that could take her further than he ever went. Would her father want her to stay safe at Giovanni's? Or would he want her to take a risk and reach for something bigger? Maria was still wrestling with this question when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find Vincent approaching, holding 2 glasses of wine. He sat down beside her without saying anything and handed her a glass. They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, sipping their wine, both lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Vincent spoke. He told Maria that he had something to show her, something he had been saving for the right moment. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded newspaper, yellowed with age. He handed it to Maria and told her to read it. Maria unfolded the newspaper carefully, afraid it might fall apart in her hands. It was dated almost 40 years ago, from a small Italian-American newspaper in Brooklyn. There was an article on the front page about a local singer named Sofia Romano, who had been offered a recording contract by a big record label. The article described how Sofia had turned down the offer, choosing instead to stay with her family and continue singing in her community. Beneath the headline was a photograph of a beautiful young woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. Vincent's mother. Vincent explained that his mother had faced the same decision Maria was facing now. She had chosen family over fame, and she had never regretted it. But he added quickly that his mother's choice wasn't necessarily the right choice for everyone. Each person had to decide for themselves what mattered most, what would make them happy, what would allow them to live without regret. Maria looked at the photograph of Sofia Romano for a long time, seeing in her face the same kindness she saw in Vincent's eyes when he thought no one was watching. She thought about what it meant to choose, to commit to a path without knowing where it would lead. She thought about her father, about the music they made together, about the promise she made him as he lay dying. Then she knew what she had to do. Vincent's mother, Sofia Romano, had come to America from Italy when she was just 16 years old. She had a voice like an angel, or so everyone said, a voice that could make grown men weep and hard women smile. She sang in small clubs and at private parties, never famous, but always beloved by those who heard her. When she married Vincent's father and had children, she gave up singing professionally to raise her family. But she never stopped singing at home, filling their little apartment with Italian melodies that wrapped around young Vincent like a warm blanket. Sofia died of a sudden illness when Vincent was 12, and something inside him died with her. He stopped listening to music. He couldn't bear it. Every song reminded him of his mother, of what he had lost, of the silence that now filled their apartment. His father became distant and cold, burying his grief in work, leading Vincent to raise himself. Vincent learned that the world was harsh, that success came only to those who were tough enough to fight for it. He built Giovanni's with his bare hands and his iron will, creating something his mother would have been proud of. But he never let music back into his life. It hurt too much. Now, sitting across from this homeless girl who played trumpet like she was channeling something divine, Vincent felt that old wound opening up again. But this time, it didn't just hurt. It also felt like healing, like light entering a dark room for the first time in decades. He told Maria about his mother, haltingly at first, then with more confidence as the words began to flow. He had never told anyone this story before. He didn't know why he was telling it now, to a stranger, to a homeless teenager he had been ready to chase away just an hour ago. Maria listened to Vincent's story with tears in her eyes. She understood what he was telling her, understood it in her bones. They had both lost the person who gave them music. They had both been broken by that loss. But somehow, impossibly, music had brought them together on this random evening. In front of this fancy restaurant, two wounded souls recognizing each other across an impossible divide. When Vincent finished speaking, he sat back in his chair and rubbed his face with both hands, looking tired and vulnerable in a way Maria suspected he never showed anyone. Then he straightened up, his businessman's armor clicking back into place, and made Maria an offer that changed everything. He offered her a job, not just any job, but a real position, playing trumpet at Giovanni's every Friday and Saturday night. He would pay her properly, like a professional musician. He would arrange for her to shower at the restaurant before her performances. If she worked out, if she drew customers, he might even help her find a small apartment, nothing fancy, but something with 4 walls and a roof. A place to sleep that wasn't a doorway or a shelter cot. Maria couldn't believe what she was hearing. She asked him to repeat the offer, sure she had misunderstood. Vincent repeated it, his voice gruff as always but his eyes kind. He said he wasn't doing this out of charity. He was doing it because he was a businessman, and having live jazz music would bring in more customers, especially the kind of wealthy jazz lovers who spent big money on wine and dessert. It was a business decision, nothing more. But Maria could see the truth underneath his practical words. This was about more than business. This was about the music he had lost when his mother died. This was about recognizing a kindred spirit in the most unlikely place. This was about reaching out a hand to someone drowning, the way Vincent wished someone had reached out to him all those years ago. Maria said, yes, before he could change his mind. Her voice cracked as she thanked him, trying to express a gratitude that words couldn't capture. Vincent waved away her thanks with a grunt, clearly uncomfortable with emotional displays. He told her to come back Friday at 6 o'clock, cleaned up and ready to play. Then he called the waiter over and ordered a box of food for Maria to take with her, enough to last several days. He also pressed some cash into her hand, telling her it was an advance on her first paycheck. Maria walked out of Giovanni's that night, feeling like she was floating. The streets she had wandered in despair now seemed different, softer somehow, full of possibility. She clutched the food and money in one hand and her trumpet case in the other, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. For the first time since her father died, she felt hope. The next few days passed in a blur of anticipation and anxiety. Maria used some of the money Vincent gave her to access the showers at a gym, paying the daily fee so she could wash properly. She found a thrift store and bought herself a simple black dress, the kind musicians wore when they performed. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean and neat and made her feel almost normal. She practiced her trumpet in the park, running through jazz standards she knew her father loved, building a repertoire she could perform at Giovanni's. Friday evening arrived faster than Maria expected. She showed up at the restaurant at 5:30, half an hour early, so nervous she could barely breathe. Vincent met her at the back entrance and led her to a small office where she could get ready. He had set out a mirror and some basic makeup, items he had purchased specifically for her, though he pretended they had just been lying around. Maria felt another wave of gratitude wash over her, but she knew better than to express it too enthusiastically. Vincent didn't like being thanked. At 7 o'clock, Maria stepped out onto the small stage area Vincent had set up in the corner of the restaurant. She was trembling so hard, she worried she wouldn't be able to hold her trumpet steady. The restaurant was packed, every table full of well-dressed diners who paused their conversations to look at her. She was suddenly aware, again, of who she was, where she came from, the months she had spent sleeping in doorways and begging for coins. What right did she have to stand before these people? What right did she have to take up space in this beautiful restaurant? Then she saw Vincent, standing in the back near the kitchen, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. He gave her a tiny nod, almost imperceptible, and somehow that small gesture gave Maria the courage she needed. She lifted her trumpet, closed her eyes, and began to play. From the very first note, Maria knew this performance would be different from anything she had done on the street. The acoustics in Giovanni's were perfect, making her trumpet sound richer and fuller than ever before. The warm lighting and elegant surroundings created an atmosphere that elevated her music, transformed it from street corner noise into something magical. She started with a classic jazz piece, one her father used to play. Feeling his presence beside her as if he were standing on the stage himself, the restaurant fell silent. Conversations stopped. Forks were set down. Every person in Giovanni's was focused entirely on the young woman with the battered trumpet, watching in amazement as she poured her soul into the music. A businessman who had come to impress a client found tears streaming down his cheeks. A couple celebrating their 10th anniversary held hands across the table, transported back to the night they first met. An elderly woman dining alone smiled for the first time. Since her husband's funeral 3 months earlier, Maria played for 2 hours that night, taking short breaks to rest her lips and drink water. She moved through jazz standards and original pieces, fast songs and slow ones, happy melodies and heartbreaking ballads. By the end of the evening, The entire restaurant was under her spell. When she played her final note and lowered her trumpet, the applause was thunderous. People rose from their seats to give her a standing ovation. Someone shouted for an encore. Someone else threw money onto the stage. A gesture usually reserved for street performers, but in this context, it felt like the highest compliment. Vincent watched from the back. His arms still crossed, his expression still guarded. But Maria could see the shimmer in his eyes, the proud smile he was trying to hide. She had done it. She had proved herself. She had earned her place. After the restaurant closed that night, Vincent handed Maria an envelope containing her payment. It was more money than she had seen in months, more than she had earned in weeks of playing on street corners. But that wasn't what made Maria's heart soar. It was the words Vincent said as he handed her the envelope, words that felt like a blessing from a father figure she desperately needed. He told her she played exactly like his mother used to sing. Maria met with Derek Patterson the following week, but not to sign his contract. She arrived at his office with a counter-proposal, one that shocked him into silence. She told him she would consider recording music, but only under very specific conditions. She wanted to maintain creative control over her music. She wanted to continue performing at Giovanni's, at least occasionally, even if she became successful. She wanted any contract to include provisions for donating a percentage of profits to homeless youth programs in Chicago. And she wanted Vincent Romano named as her advisor on all business decisions. Derek tried to negotiate, tried to charm her, tried to pressure her. But Maria had learned something important during her time on the streets. She had learned that she could survive anything. She had learned that she didn't need what Derek was offering. Not really. She wanted it, sure, but she didn't need it. That gave her power, the power to walk away, and Derek could sense it. For the first time in his career, he found himself agreeing to terms he would never have accepted from anyone else. The next 2 years were a whirlwind of activity. Maria recorded her first album in a professional studio, an experience that was both thrilling and terrifying. She wasn't used to the technology, the multiple takes, the technical perfection that recording demanded. But she adapted, learned, grew. The album was called Street Song, and it featured a mix of jazz standards and original compositions, including the piece she had played for Vincent on that fateful first night. The cover showed Maria holding her father's trumpet, wearing the same black dress she had bought at the thrift store. The album was a moderate success, well reviewed by critics and embraced by jazz enthusiasts. It didn't make Maria a superstar, but it opened doors that had been closed to her before. She was invited to play at jazz festivals and music venues across the country. She was interviewed by magazines and newspapers, her story of homelessness to success inspiring readers and listeners. She was featured in a documentary about young musicians overcoming adversity, her segment moving viewers to tears. Through it all, Maria kept her promise to Vincent. She continued playing at Giovanni's whenever she was in Chicago, even as her schedule became increasingly packed. Those performances were special, different from the concerts and festivals. At Giovanni's, she could relax, experiment, play for the joy of it rather than for the cameras and critics. Vincent would sit in his usual spot in the back, watching her with the same expression he always wore, that mixture of pride and protectiveness that made Maria feel safe. But as Maria's star rose, she began to notice changes in herself, changes that troubled her. She was becoming used to nice hotels and first-class flights. She was starting to recognize her face in advertisements and on posters. People stopped her on the street to ask for autographs, to tell her how much her music meant to them. It was flattering, intoxicating even, but it also felt dangerous, like standing at the edge of a cliff with a beautiful view, knowing that one wrong step could send her tumbling into an abyss. She remembered what her father used to say about famous musicians who lost themselves to success. He would shake his head sadly and say that they had traded their souls for applause, that they played notes instead of emotions, that their music had become empty and hollow. Maria was terrified of becoming one of those people. She clung to her father's trumpet like a talisman, refusing to upgrade to a newer, better instrument no matter how many times it was offered. That battered old trumpet kept her grounded, reminded her of where she came from, of who she really was. The true test came during a concert in New York City, the biggest performance of Maria's career so far. The venue held 3,000 people, and every seat was filled. The audience included record executives, music critics, celebrities, and the kind of wealthy patrons who could launch a career with a single phone call. Maria had prepared for months, rehearsing her set list until she could play it in her sleep, making sure everything was perfect. But as she stood backstage, waiting for her cue to go on, something happened that threatened to destroy everything. She received a phone call from Vincent. His voice was weak, strained in a way Maria had never heard before. He told her that he was in the hospital. He had collapsed at the restaurant that afternoon. The doctor said it was his heart, that he needed surgery, that the next few days would be critical. He was calling to wish her luck on her concert, to tell her to play her heart out, to assure her that he would be watching from his hospital bed. Maria's world tilted on its axis. Vincent, the man who had saved her life, who had given her a chance when no one else would, who had become the father figure she desperately needed, was lying in a hospital bed while she stood in a concert hall 3 states away. Every instinct told her to cancel the concert, to get on the first plane back to Chicago, to be at Vincent's side. What was a concert compared to the man who had changed her life? But Vincent wouldn't hear of it. He told her in that gruff voice that she loved so much, that he would never forgive her if she threw away this opportunity for him. He reminded her of her father's words about never letting anyone take the music from her heart. He said that the best thing she could do for him was to play, to honor the gift that had brought them together, to show the world what she was capable of. Then he told her he loved her, words he had never said before, and the phone went silent. Maria stood backstage with tears streaming down her face, her trumpet clutched in her shaking hands. She could hear the murmur of the audience through the curtain, thousands of people waiting to hear her play. In that moment, she felt more alone than she had during all her months on the street. She thought about her father, dying in a hospital bed while she held his hand. She thought about Vincent, alone in another hospital bed, fighting for his life. She thought about all the loss she had endured, all the pain she had survived, and she thought about the music, about what it had given her, about what it could give to the people waiting in that concert hall. Music had saved her from despair when she was homeless. Music had created a connection with Vincent that transcended words. Music was the language of the soul, and tonight, her soul needed to speak. Maria wiped her tears, squared her shoulders, and walked onto that stage. The lights were blinding after the darkness backstage, the applause deafening after the silence. She could barely see the audience, just a sea of shadows beyond the glare. She raised her father's trumpet to her lips, and for a moment, she couldn't make a sound. Her throat was tight with grief, her breath caught in her chest. Then she thought of Vincent watching from his hospital bed, waiting to hear her play. She thought of her father watching from wherever spirits go when they leave this world. She thought of all the people in this audience who had come seeking something: healing, joy, connection, escape. And Maria began to play. What came out of her trumpet that night was unlike anything she had ever played before. It was raw and broken and beautiful beyond description. She abandoned her carefully rehearsed set list and played from her heart, letting the music take her wherever it wanted to go. She played grief and hope, despair and triumph, death and life. She played her story, from the happy childhood with her father, to the dark days on the street, to the miracle of that evening outside Giovanni's. She played for Vincent, for her father, for every person who had ever been lost and alone and searching for a way home. The audience sat in stunned silence, many of them weeping openly. Critics later described it as one of the most powerful musical performances they had ever witnessed. But Maria didn't know any of this as she played. She was somewhere else, somewhere deep inside herself, in a place where music and memory merged into something transcendent. She played for over 2 hours without stopping, her lips raw and her arms aching, pouring everything she had into that battered old trumpet. When she finally lowered the instrument and opened her eyes, the silence lasted for 1 heartbeat, then 2. Then the entire concert hall erupted in the most thunderous applause Maria had ever heard. People rose to their feet, cheering, crying, shouting her name. The sound washed over her like a wave, and she felt her legs give out beneath her. She dropped to her knees on that stage, clutching her father's trumpet, sobbing with exhaustion and emotion, and released thought she had done it. She had played through the pain. She had honored her father's memory and her promise to Vincent. She had given everything she had to a roomful of strangers, and they had received it with open hearts. But even in that moment of triumph, Maria's thoughts were 3 states away, in a hospital room in Chicago, where the man who had saved her life was fighting his own battle. Maria caught the first flight back to Chicago the next morning, barely sleeping, her mind racing with worry. She went straight from the airport to the hospital, still wearing the black dress from her concert, her eyes red from crying and exhaustion. The nurses told her that Vincent had watched her entire performance on his tablet, refusing to sleep until she had finished playing. They said he had smiled, really smiled, for the first time since he was admitted. Then he had closed his eyes and slept peacefully through the night. Vincent's surgery was successful, though the recovery would be long and difficult. The doctor said he needed to reduce his stress, to step back from running Giovanni's, to take care of himself for once instead of everyone else. Vincent grumbled and protested, claiming he would die of boredom before his heart gave out again. But Maria could see the fear in his eyes, the understanding that he was mortal, that his time was limited, that he couldn't go on forever. Over the following months, Maria made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her. She took a break from touring and recording to help Vincent during his recovery. She moved back into her small Chicago apartment and divided her time between caring for Vincent and playing at Giovanni's. The restaurant had become like a second home to her, and the regular customers had become like family. She didn't want to lose that, not even for fame and success. Derek Patterson was furious when Maria told him her plans. He called her foolish, ungrateful, self-destructive. He warned that the music industry had a short memory, that her momentum would be lost, that she would never recapture the buzz she had generated. Maria listened to his concerns politely, then told him that some things were more important than buzz. She hung up the phone feeling lighter than she had in months. The time Maria spent with Vincent during his recovery was precious in ways she hadn't expected. Freed from the demands of running his restaurant, Vincent finally had time to talk, really talk, about his life, his regrets, his hopes. He told Maria stories about his mother that he had never shared with anyone, about her singing and her kindness and her faith, that everything would work out in the end. He talked about his own struggles, the loneliness of success, the sacrifices he had made to build Giovanni's. He spoke about how meeting Maria had changed something fundamental in him, had reopened doors he thought he had locked forever. Maria shared her own stories too, memories of her father that she had kept locked away because they hurt too much to examine. But now, sitting beside Vincent's bed in the soft afternoon light, those memories felt different. They weren't just painful anymore. They were also beautiful, precious, gifts from a man who had loved her more than anything in the world. She and Vincent would talk for hours, their 2 stories of loss and music and survival weaving together into something new, something neither of them could have created alone. As Vincent grew stronger, he began talking about the future. He was ready to retire, he said, ready to pass Giovanni's on to someone younger and more energetic. He had been thinking about who that someone might be, and he had an idea that Maria found both terrifying and thrilling. He wanted to give the restaurant to her. Maria tried to refuse. She wasn't a businesswoman, she said. She was a musician. She didn't know anything about running a restaurant. But Vincent waved away her objections with his usual gruffness. He said she could hire people who knew the business side. What she brought was something more important, something that couldn't be taught or bought. She brought the music. She brought the magic that had transformed Giovanni's from a nice Italian restaurant into something special. She brought the thing his mother had given to their little apartment in Brooklyn all those years ago. The transition took nearly a year to complete. Maria learned everything she could about running Giovanni's while still performing there on weekends and occasionally accepting concert invitations that didn't require extended travel. She hired a manager to handle the day-to-day operations and a chef who had trained under the original Giovanni's team. She made small changes to the restaurant, adding more live music nights, creating a scholarship program for young musicians from difficult backgrounds, establishing Giovanni's as a place where music and food and community came together in celebration of life. On the night Maria officially became the owner of Giovanni's, she hosted a special dinner for all the people who had supported her along the way. The homeless shelter workers who had helped her survive those dark early days were there. The thrift store owner who had sold her that first black dress was there. Derek Patterson even showed up, having eventually made peace with Maria's choices, admitting grudgingly that she seemed happier than any of his more famous clients. And Vincent was there, of course, sitting at the best table in the house, looking healthier than he had in years. Maria played that night, as she did every night she was at Giovanni's. But before she began, she asked for a moment of silence. She told the gathered crowd about her father, about the trumpet that had belonged to him, about the promise she had made as he lay dying. She talked about hitting rock bottom and being lifted up, about how a single act of kindness from a stranger had changed the trajectory of her entire life. She looked at Vincent as she spoke, seeing in his eyes all the love and pride he struggled to express in words. Then Maria raised her father's trumpet, that battered, dented, beautiful instrument that had carried her through the darkest nights and the brightest days. She placed her lips against the mouthpiece that had touched her father's lips thousands of times before, and she began to play. The music that filled Giovanni's that night was different from anything Maria had played before. It was a new piece, one she had been working on for months, a composition that told the story of her journey. It started soft and sad, a lonely melody that spoke of loss and grief and cold nights on unforgiving streets. Then it grew, adding layers of warmth as kindness entered the story, as a gruff restaurant owner took a chance on a desperate girl. The music swelled into something triumphant and hopeful, celebrating the power of second chances and human connection. The final notes of the piece were dedicated to her father, a conversation between the daughter he had raised and the man she had become. Maria imagined him standing beside her, his own trumpet in his hands, playing along as they had done so many times in their little apartment. She could almost hear his voice in the silence between notes, telling her he was proud, telling her she had kept her promise, telling her the music would never die as long as she kept it alive. When Maria lowered her trumpet and opened her eyes, the restaurant was silent for a long moment. Then the applause began, not the polished clapping of a concert hall, but something warmer and more personal, the appreciation of people who knew her story and understood what this moment meant. Vincent was standing at his table, clapping harder than anyone, not bothering to hide the tears streaming down his weathered face. Maria looked around at the restaurant that was now hers, at the faces of people who had become her family, at the portrait of Sofia Romano that Vincent had hung near the stage. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from a grieving teenager to a homeless street musician to the owner of one of Chicago's most beloved restaurants. She thought about all the pain and all the beauty, all the loss and all the love. And she smiled, truly smiled, because she knew that her father was right all along. As long as she could play, he would always be with her. As long as the music lived, nothing was truly lost. The trumpet in her hands was more than an instrument. It was a bridge between past and present, between the living and the dead, between who she had been and who she had become. Maria Santos had once asked a stranger if she could play for a free meal. That stranger had laughed at her, mocked her, dismissed her as nothing more than a homeless nuisance. But she had played anyway, pouring her heart into her father's trumpet, and everything had changed. Now she stood in her own restaurant, surrounded by love and music and possibility. Proof that even the darkest night eventually gives way to dawn. Outside Giovanni's window, the city of Chicago sparkled with a million lights. Somewhere out there, another homeless teenager was curled up in a doorway, wondering if tomorrow would bring anything better. Maria made a silent promise to find those young people, to help them the way Vincent had helped her, to pass on the gift of hope that had saved her life. The music never dies. It just waits for the right person to play it.